about promises.
All the questions.
Yeah. So the first question is like, what is it?
Yeah. So Ben, you referenced in Slack, and I think I get kind of the premise behind it, but I feel like I don't know anything about it.
Okay.
Like, that's how and when the promises or callbacks are used, or the relationship, maybe if there is one.
Yeah. How and when to use them? How are they related to callbacks?
Yeah.
Why do we need them? Other questions? Andrew?
What is like the non-programmer definition of asynchronous?
I can try. But yeah, we'll cover that like in describing asynchronous. Actually, yeah, that might be a fairly simple explanation. Cool. I think these lesson objectives will cover all these things, but if not, we'll come back to them. First thing, let's talk about what asynchronous actually means. So when something is synchronous, that means it happens one at a time. So if I log hello at the top, and then I log hello at the bottom, and then I log hello, well, let's put it in quotes, at the middle. When I run this code, it's going to run sequentially, right? It runs line 1, then it runs line 3, then it runs line 5. It goes from the top to the bottom. So this code can be called synchronous because it goes one line at a time. And let's just run it. It should do exactly what we expect it to do. Top, middle, bottom, right? When we talk about asynchronous, the idea is code isn't running from the top to the bottom. It could potentially be called in any order. And when something when a method like requires a callback or requires a promise, it is asynchronous in that the code is not going to run right away. It's going to be called at a later time. So one thing built into the JavaScript engine is like this set timeout thing, where I can pass in a function and say, in 1 second, call this function and invoke that. But now, when I run this code, we're going to get a little bit different behavior because this code right here is being delayed. So this line of code is not going to run until a second later. So this code is, and even for me this is hard to see, but this code is asynchronous and it's not sequential because the way we read this from top to bottom is not how the actual code will be run. This line will be run, this line will set the timeout, then this line will run, and then a second later, that log will happen. So now if I run this code, we'll see top, bottom, and then a second later, we see middle. So the idea of something being asynchronous is it's not sequential. It's not from the top to the bottom. It's going to be run at some other time. In this very contrived example, it's very specific. Okay, a second from now, this line of code is going to run. But when we're dealing with stuff like AJAX requests, we don't know how long they're going to take. They could take 5 minutes. They could take a year. Probably won't take a year. The request will time out. But the idea is when we're dealing with HTTP requests and responses, it's going to take time. It's not done immediately. So we need callback functions or promises which wait for that thing to be done, and then when they're done, the code inside of that callback will be invoked. So ultimately, asynchronous means not sequential, not synchronous, can run in a different order than the code in which the code is defined. Questions about that? So this is define and describe asynchronous. So just think about it for even look at this code for 30 seconds. If you were to describe asynchronous to your mom or your grandma or your dog, how would you do it? Okay, can I have a volunteer? Will.
Well, as far as just plain English goes, chronological would be a past tense version of synchronous. Synchronous is in the now, a chronological order, and asynchronous is defined negatively to that. And so in this context, it seems like top to bottom would be a timeline, and like the chronology, that would be like synchronous. Whereas like asynchronous just means that it doesn't follow that exact order, but it's the time.
Yeah, it doesn't follow a timeline. Do you have something?
I was just gonna say outside the normal order of things.
Outside the normal order of things. Let's write that down. That sounds like something from a Harry Potter novel.
Something that happens after something else happens.
James Bond
You know,
movie.
little
Die
things.
another day, tomorrow, yesterday, last night.
Something that happens after
Something else happens.
and I'm gonna add, and not exactly in that order.
Not consecutive.
Or could it be like something that happens after something specific happens?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that too, because I mean, at the same time, the code is predictable in that we know that the thing that is asynchronous won't run until we want it to, or until something is done. So can you say that again?
Something that happens after something specific happens.
Happens. I like it because then we can define something specific. So this is an AJAX request. This is a database lookup. This is. Can anybody read my screen right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's an AJAX request, a database lookup, a set timeout, any sort of long-running operation.
Which we still don't know how long that'll take, but at least we know that whenever we do our thing, it could take whatever, but then we know that specific thing is going to happen. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, definitely.
I like the specific
So you
thing.
set
Like,
a timeout in the bottom console.log at 1500.
Let's try it.
So they still ran in order. Would that no longer be async?
Well, there's still they're still asynchronous because the code isn't happening one line at a time. There's special things happening behind the scenes with set timeout where this is literally putting that function in a queue, and then when the timer goes off, it then invokes that function. So the fact that the code didn't run one after another still makes it asynchronous. But this would actually fix our problem because this timeout should finish before this timeout, and so we will see top, middle, bottom. Top, middle, bottom. Yeah.
So that's still async.
It still is, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, really?
So can you chain them? So like if you put like a timeout of half a second inside of the timeout for a second, could you kind of like chain?
Yeah, and really when we start talking about promises, that's where that can come into play, because that's where like .then feels very natural. It's like, wait for this thing to happen, then run this function, then run another function, then run another function. So you can like chain it in that fashion. But in this case, if we put the timeout inside of here, this second timeout is actually going to wait 2.5 seconds because it's going to wait a second and then it'll be triggered, which is a second and a half. So it like adds up. So at the top, at the bottom, and then 100 milliseconds later. Middle and then bottom. So this is the beginnings of things being asynchronous. Like they're not running exactly top down in the code. And like really yesterday when we were talking about higher order functions, like that's what allows this to happen. We can put a block of code in a function and say, okay, later on, I want this block of code to run, not right now. So I think we've kind of done that. Define and describe promises. Okay, so promises are something now built into browsers that make dealing with callbacks a little bit nicer. So promises themselves, you actually are still using, you can call them callback functions, but they make it easier to deal with those functions. And let me give an example of that. So let me actually just save this. I'll call this, let's do that. Duplicate promise.
Are they made to be broken?
Promises? Yeah, they are. What is async? Okay, and then got our promises here. So, and actually, let's bring in jQuery into this document. I haven't used this in a while. Do I have CDN? Yeah, I can search for CDNs. jQuery 321 core.
Okay,
Oh,
right there.
I didn't
Why
want to do
would
that.
you use 3 versus 2 versus 1 in jQuery?
Yeah, so version 3 is the most modern, and that's the one that has promise support built into it.
Oh.
Version 2, like with each new version, they actually supported less and less browsers. I think version 3 only goes back to a certain support of IE. Yeah, I just want to get the URL.
Yeah, what's the difference when when you go on the website and it says download? Like, what does that do? Download to your computer?
So that's literally going to take this JavaScript file and you put it somewhere on your computer. And then instead of this source being the full URL to the website, it could literally just be the file. Exactly. Yeah.
But it's slower,
It wouldn't be slower.
like on an online server? Or?
So if you do this, then wherever you're hosting your web page, that is going to have to serve up that jQuery file.
Yeah.
If you do that, then it's going to be served from this, what's known as a CDN, a content delivery network. And the idea is if other web pages have included this same URL, whoever's looking at your web page has already cached this version of jQuery, so it actually might be a little bit faster.
And if it's minified, it's even better, like across the board for download or whatever.
Yeah, so you'll see jQuery, or you'll still jQuery.min. Min is like a smaller file size. Not going to worry about that for now. Okay, I have jQuery on the page. Let's use it. So right here, I'm going to do $.get. Actually, I'll contact my Slowpoke API. So yes, this is going to be the, well, what do you, quick stretch. Okay, get that URL. And actually, let's just do this. I'll say var result equals, and actually I have to make a post request against this. So I'm going to post an object that has a message that says, promises are fun. Okay, if I just log this result, what I'm going to get back is not the result of the post request, right? Is not the response of this thing, because this code is sequential, right? Result and then log result. So let's see what happens when I do that. And for this, I'm very much going to be using HTTP server. All this does is start up a server locally on my machine, serving the files inside of this folder. So now in my browser, when I go to this URL, I'm actually seeing that code. Programming 101, bring in your JavaScript file. So I'm going to bring in promise.js. Okay, so that console log is not the actual response from the API request. It is this object that represents the request. So if you look at the jQuery docs, there's a few different ways to get data back from a call. One thing you can do is pass in a callback function. So this function will get called when the thing is done. So let's put result right there. And so now this callback function will log the result. Hard refresh. Cool. I need to post /say. Waiting. Okay, and I get back the result. But in this specific case, I have this function, and then I'm passing a function as a second parameter. This is the callback that gets called when the response is received in the browser. The alternative to doing this is using promises. So instead of having a second parameter there, you use .then. So we basically take that function, and then on the end of this, say .then, and pass that function into there. Now, that should be a period. This is going to behave exactly the same way, but now we're using the power of promises. So if we do this, and wait, it's Slowpoke. It'll take a few seconds. But that now works in the exact same way. So the idea is this right here returns a promise. So let's call it $promise. And a promise represents a value that will be resolved in the future. At some point, we don't know when. But the way we can use it is we can say .then. Basically, hey promise, whenever you resolve, that's going to be in the future at some point, then please invoke this function and pass in your data to it. So this is just another way of dealing with asynchronous behavior. You take the promise, do .then, and you can do something with it.
And no matter where you put it, it does it when it's resolved. Like, no matter where in the script you have .then.
Exactly. So basically, before I just literally put it on the end there. Now I'm storing this thing in a variable and then putting .bin on the end of it.
Yeah.
Those two are exactly the same because the result of calling post is a promise, something that represents a future value.
So if you like console.log, like it wouldn't matter. Like it's like, and if you did it right, or like even if you choose console.log, like I'm here or something, like before or after, it doesn't matter. It's just like, so whenever you get that response back, it's gonna do the result. Right?
Yes.
Still here.
It's going to get pretty confusing, but I'm up here. Okay.
You put numbers.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but let's do this as an exercise. Which console log is going to happen first?
I'm up here.
Yeah. So this is going to be the first one. Which one will happen second?
I'm here.
It will, because it's in the document. It's outside of any like function that might be called later. Which will be called third?
I'm over here.
10.
We have a vote for line 14.
10.
Vote for line 10. Any guesses, guys?
What does it
14.
Given that the API that we're contacting, the purpose of it is a delay, then the last.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even if it wasn't delayed, but yes. So this is actually going to be the next one that's logged. Think about like sequential code, because when this file is first run, it's going to be run top to bottom. So even if this were to finish immediately, this line of code would still run first,
Really?
because
Even if it was like right away.
yeah, and actually we could demo that with a timeout, but
Wait, why?
because it's running sequentially. So when this file runs, all of these lines run, right?
So if you put console log 2 on here above var promise,
That's still,
if it's third in the chain of what would happen and then it's called, would it technically call
doesn't
third
like
then?
the thing to pay attention to is this console log is inside of a function that's ultimately a callback.
Gotcha.
So this console log is not inside of anything, so it's always going to be run before anything that's inside of a function, inside of a callback. And let's put that there. Let's show this real quick. This should happen. So 1, 2, 3, and then 4 when the data actually comes back. Let's do it again. 4 should take a little bit longer because it doesn't happen until we actually get the data. 4. But yeah, just as another example, even if I did something like this, so a set timeout, you can specify a function without a value and it will get called immediately. But because it's asynchronous, this actually be 5. So even though this, like it looks like that's going to run immediately because you're setting the timeout, it still behaves asynchronously in that all of the code outside of it runs first, and then the timeout will happen, and that console log will get called.
In the console, sorry.
Go ahead.
How does that work with function hoisted? So like if it's within a function, but the function is hoisted to the top, like it's called up above things,
So
will it
the
still run after the other stuff?
it still will, mainly because these are just function definitions, declarations. They are not function invocations. So let's pull this out and call it a function called number 4. And then right here we'll call it number 4. And then out here we'll pull this out and we'll call this number 5. We have a function called number 5. Oh, cool.
This is an interview question.
Let's do this so we can see everything. So even though these functions are defined outside of it, they're not going to be invoked until the promise is resolved here or until that set timeout gets called. So it still happens in the same order. So this happens, then this, then number 4 because it's a set timeout, and then number 5 because it has to wait for the promise to come back.
And so there, like the set timeout like sets it aside for everything else, and the promise is like paging, waiting for an answer to come back. But if, for example, the set timeout was 3,000 and the promise took like 2,000 milliseconds to come back, then the promise would run first.
It actually wouldn't because of the way this behaves. So because
That's
of
what I was asking.
because of set timeout, basically once all this code runs and it reaches the end of the file, this set timeout will be called immediately after that. Even if this dot then came before it, mainly because this set timeout is being called with literally no timeout. Where if you watch the video about the event queue, we're literally pushing this into the queue, and then it's being called immediately after that. So it would have come back before this promise ever came back.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah, so the set timeout. Oh, okay. So I mean, even if it's sitting over there waiting, and the promise got paged first, and then is like fulfilled before the timeout is done, the timeout would still return first.
That's a curious question. I guess I don't have an API to test it because this is always like a random timeout, like the Slowpoke API. That said, it might actually run first. Like especially if let's do a timeout of like 3,000 milliseconds, because we know that curious. Let's do like 10 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Interesting.
But it really comes down to the timeout. But the special case here is no timeout at all, and so no matter what, this is always going to finish first, even if this took like less milliseconds.
So basically, like, it runs everything that's not in a function.
Yeah, in a callback,
In
in
a
a function.
callback.
Yeah.
And then everything in the callbacks are based off of like how long that takes. But so if you did two set timeouts like right after each other, and they have the exact same timeout, it would be the first one because it was like fired off like
Exactly.
tiny.
So that one was pushed into the queue before the other one, so it'll fire. Number 6 will actually print 5. I don't know. This could get really confusing. It is. It's really confusing.
Is this how you hire people?
Like by doing this problem?
Yeah, like solve this for me.
It is essential to like understanding JavaScript because the asynchronous state, like you're gonna come across this everywhere. So honestly, like this breakout has really just been focused on asynchronous, less about promises. But the thing to think about and the thing to take away is like when you're working on the OMDB AJAX exercise, you have to use like a .then, or you could pass a callback as a second parameter. But because it's an asynchronous request, you're not going to get the data immediately.
I have one more question. So promises are jQuery specific?
No, promises are in the browser. So, and that's the other thing. Like if you look at promises on jQuery, you'll see a term called the deferred object. So jQuery's deferred was like what people used before promises became a standard. And if you look at even if you look at Ajax. When you see .done or .fail, that's referring to a deferred, but a promise is the new standard. It's built into browsers. It's not something jQuery specific, and the terms they use are .then and .catch. Catch.
Isn't done.
So fetch has a promise interface. Actually, I can show that too. We're out of time. We gotta get out of here though. But the idea is if the promise had some sort of error, we could see that error in the .catch. So let's say I make a request out to just like some site that doesn't exist. This catch is going to get called.
Oh, it's an error.
Error, and then we just get this big error object. Well, is that it? No. Yeah, that's the error object. But this .catch is super convenient, and typically when you're using promises, you want to throw that on there just in case like there's a network timeout or you spelled the URL wrong or something goes wrong. You'll see that actually logged in the console. This is slow poke-api.
So you would tag along, you'd add a catch to the chain of things you're sticking on the end of your original Git or post request.
Yeah, it will be.
You were like the first person to even notice it. Every time I save my file, I get a little encouragement.
Oh, I've been looking at that.
You
every
rock!
time.
Well done!
Oh.
Yep! Bravo! Nice
Thanks a
job.
lot.
Just like the mastery dashboard.
Oh yeah. So I got
Same
the,
thing, yeah.
I put that into there. So when you check a box, you'll get a little
That's
encouragement.
where I've seen it. Okay.
Cool. We got to go back to class. Any last questions or comments on async or promises? And again, we didn't get too deep. Like, there's a lot more that goes into promises. Really, we just talked about asynchronous behavior and what you're going to come up against. Yeah, and so I'll leave you with, like, you're going to be calling the OMDB API, whatever that URL is. And then you're going to say .then, and you have a function that gives you back the search results. And then you can do something with the results. So let's say like iterate over and add to DOM.
So is OMDB API just basically like a mirror to reflect whatever you want, or is it just
Oh, no,
messages? Or
You can check out there. So it's the Open Movie Database. Quick stretch. But it's an open source movie database API. So they have just a database of like so many different movies. So you can search for movies by title. But if you just check out their website, you can read, like you can request specific movies by ID. You can search. I think you can filter by genre. But this is an API with just a bunch of movie data in it, basically.
Don't need an account, bro.
Nope. Anything else? All right. Thank you all.